Hey guys, Mr. G here. In this video, we're going to continue to take a look at examples of graphing trig functions with graph transformations. All right, now what we're going to do for each example is we're going to figure out all of the information for the function. And what I mean by that is what is going to be the amplitude, the period, the quarters, the phase shift, and the vertical shift with all the three lines. We're going to label all of the information for that specific trig function, but we're also going to label the numbers that represents A, B, C, and D. All right. And remember, the setup for sine could be also applied for cosine as well. And we're also going to be using the original graphs for sine x and cosine x along with the patterns. If you guys recall, the pattern for sine is mid, max, mid, min, mid. And then for cosine, we have max, mid, min, mid, max. So that way we don't have to use the x and y table. All right. So let's go ahead and start off with the first example, example 1, where, let me move this down. Example 1, where we have sine of x minus 45. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started by labeling my numbers for A, B, C, and D. Okay, so if we compare the equation by the format, you see that for A, there is no number in front of sine, so that means that my coefficient is going to be a 1. We see for B, there's no number in front of x, so that coefficient is going to be 1. But we do see a number in the same spot for C, which is 45. And they both happen to be minus, so that's good. And remember, for C, the number for C represents a horizontal shift or phase shift. And with the rule for that, we always use the opposite sign. So this 45 is going to be a positive. If we had a positive 45 given, then my C would be a negative 45. And if you take a look, there is no number that is being added to the whole trig function. So that means that my D is going to be 0. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the amplitude, period, quarters, the midline, the max line, and the min line. All right. We're going to do that for all of the graphs. Let's go ahead and get started by figuring out the amplitude. Now with the amplitude, I just take the absolute value of A, and the absolute value of a positive 1 is still a positive 1. So my amplitude is 1 unit. All right. And then we have the period, where we take 360 degrees and divide it by whatever number B is. So for the period, I take 360 degrees and divide that by 1, and I still end up with 360 degrees. Perfect. All right, and then we have the quarters. So with the quarters, I take whatever period I had, so 360, and I divide that by 4, since quarters is associated with 4. All right. And with that, I end up with 90 degrees. So that means to get from one x value to the next, I go by 90. All right. And then we have all the three lines, the max line, the midline, and the min line. So I'm going to go ahead and label those. So we have the midline, the max line, and the min line. Okay, so let's go ahead and figure out what is my midline. So usually for the midline, it would be y equals to whatever number we labeled for D. And in this case, D is 0. So my midline is going to be y equals to 0. So now I got to figure out, well, what is the max line and what is the min line? So to figure that out, I'm going to take the number for D and add it and subtract it for the number for A. So for the max line, I'm going to do 0 plus 1, which still gives me 1. And then for the midline, I have 0 minus 1, which is negative 1. All right, so we have the amplitude, the period, the quarters, and all the three lines. So we're good to make my graph. So I'm gonna go ahead and make my graph over here. Put a little bit more space on the side. Okay, so then I have 1.51, 0.5, negative 1, positive 1, 1, 2, 3, and 4. All right. And then if we take a look, we see that there's also one more thing that I forgot in the graph. Now, if we take a look, we didn't use the number for C to figure out what the phase shift would be. So we have the phase shift. So we take the number for C, which is 45, and then divide it by the number for B, which is 1. So if I were to figure out the phase shift, I'm gonna write it down here. So for the phase shift, that's gonna be 45 units. If I do 45 divided by 1, by using the formula given, C divided by B, I end up with 45. And since this 45 is a positive, that means it's gonna go to the right direction. Not the left, but the right. So 45 units, right. All right, so we can go ahead and make my graph. And I'm gonna use the old graph for sine to help us get a new graph for cosine. So this is the old graph. We start at 0, 0. However, we see that each point is gonna go 45 units to the right. So that means instead of starting at 0, 0, I'm actually gonna start at 45, 0. So this is gonna be 45. And then for each x value, we're going in terms of 90. So that means that starting at 45, I'm gonna add it to 90. All right, so let me go ahead and just fill in the x values. So we have 45 plus 90. And that's gonna give me 135. And then add that to another 90. And that should give me, let me check, 135 plus 90, 225. So I get 225. And then if I do 225 plus 90, I end up with 315. Okay, so now let's go ahead and get started. So we start off at 45, 0, that's the midpoint. And then I'm gonna go from mid to max. So at 135, I'm up 1. Then I'm down to at 225 to the mid. Then 315, I'm at the minimum, min. And then it seems like at the 5th point, we go back to the mid, and I still need to figure out my 5th point. All right, so I'm gonna add 315 and 90, and that should give me, add that to 90, 405. So I'll go from 315 to 405, and that's gonna be my mid. And then connect my points. And there we have it. We have our graph for number 1. All right, and if we take a look, we see, compared to the old graph to the new one, I'm just gonna put it over here. We see that the graph moved 45 units to the right. Perfect. So now we're gonna do the same technique for number 2. So for number 2, all right, so we're gonna continue with number 2, where we have y equals to cosine of x plus 90 plus 1. All right, so the first thing we're gonna do is we're going to figure out my numbers for A, B, C, and D. All right, so let's take a look at what those numbers are. Now, we see that for A, there is no number in front of the trig function. So that means that the number for A is going to be a 1. Coefficient of this is 1. And then for B, which is in front of X, there is no number to be appeared in front of X, so the coefficient is 1. All right, and then we have C, and if we take a look, we see that C is in the same spot as this plus 90. So C is going to be a 90. However, we see that originally this was a negative, and to go from a negative to a positive, this 90 had to be a negative because double negatives make a positive. So C is going to be a negative 90. And then we take a look at D. We see that D is in the same spot as this positive 1. So D is going to be a 1. All right, so I have my 4 numbers, and now I'm going to go ahead and figure out all of my information. Okay, starting with the amplitude. So we have the amplitude. I just take the absolute value of whatever A is, which is 1, and absolute value of 1 is still positive 1 unit. All right, and then I need to calculate the period. All right, so the period, P-E-R-I-O-D. We have 360 divided by my number for B. So I'm going to take 360 divided by 1, and it's still 360. And then we have the quarters. So let's figure out the quarters. All right, so for the quarters, I take 360 divided by 4, and then I end up with 90. All right, and then we have the phase shift. Phase shift. So with the phase shift, we have C divided by B, and my C is a negative 90, and my B is a positive 1. So negative 90 divided by 1 is still a negative 90. And since we have a negative, and phase shift relates to horizontal shift, that means I'm moving negative 90 either to the left or to the right. Now, with this negative, the negative associates to the left side, so that means that I'm moving 90 units to the left. All right, so let's go ahead and keep going. So then we have the lines, the max line, the mid line, and the min line. So all of those 3 things associates with the number for D, and 2 of them associates with the number for A. Let's go ahead and figure out the mid line. So we have the mid line, max line, and min line. So for the midline, my y is going to equal to D, which in this case is 1. Then for the max line, I take my value for D and add it to A. So 1 plus 1, so y is going to equal 2. And then for my midline, I subtract the 2 numbers. So 1 minus 1 equals 2, 0. So I have all those 3 lines, and each of the points from the original cosine graph are going to shift 1 unit up for the vertical shift. Okay, so we can go ahead and make our graph for number 2. So for number 2, I'm going to draw it over here. All right. So I have 1, 2. In reality, I only need 5 numbers, so we're going to see what 5 numbers we're using. Right? Okay, so let's take a look at a starting point for the graph. Now, the starting point for the original graph, if you take a look, you see it was 0, 1. But now, for the phase shift, we're moving 90 units to the left, but then also I have a vertical shift with 1 unit up. All right. So instead of starting at 0, 1, I'm going to start at negative 90. So on the left side, so I'm going to write negative 90. And since I'm moving 1 up, I'm going to go from 1 to 2. So we have 1, 0.52, 0.53. So I'm at negative 90, 2. So that is my starting point. All right. And let's go ahead and actually draw the lines for the max, the mid, and the min. So this is the max. This is the mid. Excuse me. Mid, and this is the min. Okay, so let's go ahead and so we already started my graph at the max. So negative 90, 2. And let's go ahead and label the rest of the x values. So we only really need 5 numbers because we're only graphing 5 points. So we start at -90, so we have 4 more numbers to go. And then if we take a look, we have my phase shift, which is, oh, not phase shift, the quarters. We're going in terms of 90. So that means that to go from one x to another, I'm gonna add to 90. So -90 plus 90, I get 0, and then 0 plus 90 is 90, then 90 plus 90 is 180, then 180 plus 90 is 270. And I'm gonna stop right there because we have our 5 numbers. All right, so let's go ahead and make our graph. So originally we started at -90. We started at -90, comma 2 for the max. And then I'm gonna go from max to mid, so 0, comma 1. Remember, all my midlines are at 1 for my y. Then we have mid to minimum, so 90, comma 0. And then 180, comma 1, 270, comma 2. All right, so I have all of my points. And if we take a look, we see that the graph definitely moved 90 units to the left if we compare the old one to the new one. All right, so let's take a look at number 3. So for number 3, we have -2 times sine of 1/2 x. All right, so we have -2 for the amplitude, and we have a 1/2 that represents b. All right, so let's go ahead and label all my numbers. So I have A, B, C, and D. Okay, so for A, I have -2 in the front. For B, I have 1/2. For C, well, there really is no number that's being added to x or subtracted. So that means that my number for C is going to be 0, and the same thing for D, because there is no number in the same spot as D that's being added or subtracted to the whole entire function. So that's going to be 0 as well. All right, so we have our 4 numbers, and we're going to go ahead and draw the information. So starting off with the amplitude. So the amplitude, I take the absolute value of -2. Now, if I take an absolute value of -2, then my answer is going to be a +2. All right, so my amplitude is 2 units. All right, then we have the period. So the period, you take 360 divided by b, which is 1/2. So I am dividing a number by a fraction. So this is where I have to do a keep, change, flip technique. I keep this number, I change the division to a multiplication, and I flip this 1/2 into a 2. So in reality, it's actually going to be a 360 times 2. And if I multiply those 2 numbers together, I get 720. So that means that the period is going to be 720. All right, then let's figure out the quarters. So for the quarters, I take 720 divided by 4, and if I were to divide those two, so 720 divided by 4, that's going to give me 180. So to go from one x value to the next, I'm going by 180. All right, and if you take a look, we see there is no number for C, so there's not really going to be a phase shift, but I could go ahead and make my max line, my mid line, and my min line. All right, so let's go ahead and get started figuring out the midline. So we have the mid line, which is y equals to d, which is 0. Then the max line, and then the min line. So I have y equals to, for the max line, I take my numbers for d and a and then add them to each other, and I get -2. And then for the min, I have y equals to d minus a, so 0 minus -2, that's going to give me a +2. So I have my lines for the midline, the max line, and the min line. And if we notice something, we see that the max line equals to the smaller number and the min line actually equals to the larger number. So even though I did the technique correctly, I do come up with two answers that are in the wrong spot. So there are going to be some situations like that when you have a negative number in front of the whole trig function. So with that being said, I'm actually going to relabel this. So instead of this being the max line, this is actually going to be the min line. And then instead of this being the min line, that's actually going to be the max line. Now, we have a negative in the front, so that's also going to affect the original graph for sine of x. All right, so let me go ahead and make my graph. Okay. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. So I start at 0, 0. Let me go ahead and draw my lines, my max line and my mid line and my min line. 2, -2. All right. Oh, and then let me label the x values. So we go from 0, and then the quarters are 180. So 0 plus 180 is 180. 180 plus 180 is 360. 360 plus 180 is 540. 540 plus 180 is 720. All right, so we have all my y values. And then draw the lines, the max line, the mid line, and the min line. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, if you take a look, we see we have our graph for sine, and we have our points on the midline, and then we have the maximum point, which is 90, 1, and then we have our minimum point, which is 270, -1. All right, so we have the -2 that's in the front, so that's gonna affect the maximum and the minimum point. Now remember, if we have a negative in front of a function, what's gonna happen to the graph? If you guys said reflect across the x-axis, then you're absolutely right. So that means that the graph is going to flip around the x-axis. So let's see how that's gonna happen. So all the minimum points are still gonna be in the same spot. So we have the midpoint, which is 0, 0. So then originally this was 90, 1, but now it's gonna be flipped to 180, -2. All right? So remember, it's being flipped, and I have my new min line. All right? Then we go from min, or originally max, to mid. All of my midpoints stay the same. And then we're going from mid to min, but because we have a negative, that's gonna flip and go to the max. All right? And then we have back from the max to the mid. So we have our points. So with the negative in the front, that's really going to flip the graph, connect the points. And if we take a look, we see that for the sine, you see that the graph for sine, the original old graph to the new graph, we see it definitely flipped across the x-axis. All right, so let's keep going with 2 more problems. Now for number 4, we're gonna take a look at y equals to 3 times cosine of 2x. So we have 3 and 2x. So I have my numbers for a and b. So a equals to 3, b equals to 2. There's no number being added to x nor to the whole trig function. So my values for c and d are 0. All right, let's go ahead and figure out the amplitude. So we have the amplitude. If I take the absolute value of +3, I still get +3. So my amplitude is 3 units. Then I have the period. So at the period, you take 360, divide that by b, which is 2, and that should get you 180 degrees. All right? Then we have quarters. We take 180 divided by 4, and if I divide those two numbers, I should end up with 45, but let me double check. Perfect, 45. All right, so my quarters, to go from one x value to the next, I'm going in terms of 45 degrees. Okay, and there is no number for C, so there's not gonna be a phase shift. So let's go ahead and figure out the max, the mid, and the min. So I have the midline. Midline, we have y equals to d, and the number for d is 0, so y equals to 0. Then I have my max line. So for the max line, I have y equals to my number for d, which is 0, plus my number for a, which is 3. So that's gonna give me 3. And then for my min line, I have y equals to 0 minus 3, and then I get negative 3. All right? So those are all my lines. So I'm gonna go ahead and make the graph. So all I'm doing really to get the graphs is using the pattern from the original graphs to make my new graph. So 1, 2, 3, didn't really need those 2 points. 1, -1, -2, -3. All right, and I have my x-axis. All right, so I start at 0, 0, or in this case 0, 1. And then the quarters are 45. So that means I'm gonna add each x value to 45. So 0 plus 45 is 45. 45 plus 45 is 90. 90 plus 45 is 135. 135 plus 45 is 180. And that's it. I only need 5 numbers. Remember, just 5 numbers, because we're only plotting 5 points. And then let me go ahead and identify the max line, the mid line, and the min line. So I have those 3 lines, and I'm gonna go ahead and graph by using the original graph for cosine of x. All right, so we have cosine of x. Originally, so for my starting point, the original point would be 0, 1, which is a max. But now over here, my new max is at 3, so I'm gonna be at 0, 3. All right, and then moving on from max to mid, then we have 45. All right, so for the mid, it's still at 0, so 45, 0. And then we have 90. So now we're at from mid to minimum, and if we take a look at the graph, my minimum is on -3 for my y. So I have 90, -3, and then we're at from 90 to 135. So then 135 is my mid, and then we're from 135 to 180, so back from mid to max. So I'm gonna go from mid to max. There we have it. So the patterns are really helping us get our new graphs, along with the new information. So we have, all right, we just follow. We have max, mid, min, mid, max. And just like the previous problem, well, the first problem, we would have mid, max, mid, min, mid. So those are the patterns that we're using for sine and cosine functions. So let's take a look at number 5. So for number 5, we have a little bit more numbers. So we're gonna have a little bit more information, but we're still able to graph 2 times cosine of 2x minus 360 plus 1. So let's go ahead and get started by labeling my A, my B, my C, my D. So for my A, there's a number in front of cosine, which is 2. My B, there's a number in front of x, which is 2. My C there is a 360, and luckily the sign did not change, so this 360 is a positive. And then for D, we have 1, we're in the same spot as D, so D is going to be a 1. All right, so I have all my 4 numbers. So I'm gonna go ahead and figure out all of the information, starting with the amplitude. So for the amplitude, if I take the absolute value of 2, I still end up with 2. All right, so for the period, oh, excuse me. For the period, I take 360, divide that by B, which is 2, and I should end up with 180 degrees. All right, now for quarters. For quarters, I take 180, divide that by 4, and I should end up with 45. Okay, so now we actually do have a number for C, so we actually have a phase shift. So phase shift. So for the phase shift, we have my number for C, which is 360, divided by my number for B, which is 2. So 360 divided by 2 is 180. And since this is a positive, we're moving 180 units to the right. Okay, so then we have the vertical shift, which is +1. And with the vertical shift, we're able to get all of our 3 lines. So we have the midline, the max line, and the min line. So starting with the midline, my y equals to d, which in this case is 1, so y equals to 1. For my max line, we have y equals to d plus a, so we have 1 plus 2, that gives me 3. Then we have my min line, so y equals to 1 minus 2, which gives me a -1. So these are all of my lines, all right? So let's go ahead and make a graph. Right, so I'm gonna, so then I have 0, 0.51, 1.52, 2.53, 0.51. All right, then I have my x values. All right, so if we take a look, originally we start at 0. However, we have the phase shift happening 180 units to the right. So instead of starting at 0, I'm gonna start at 180 degrees, all right? And then for the quarters, to get from one x value to the next, I add each x value to 45. So if I do 180 plus 45, that should give me 225. All right, 225 plus 45, that should give me 270. 270 plus 45, that should give me 315. 315 plus 45, that should give me 360. Oh, perfect. Okay, so we can go ahead and make my graph, but before that, we have the max line, the midline, and the min line. And just make our graph. So let's start at 180. So for my cosine, I always start at the max position. So at 180, all of the max points are at 3. So I'm gonna go from, my starting point is going to be 180 comma 3. All right, because that is the max line. All the maximum points are at 3. Then I go from max to mid. So at 225, I'm at the midline, which is at 1. Then for 270, I'm at the min line. So for 200, I'm at 270. All my min lines are at -1. And then we have 315. So we have 315 for mid. So my mid is going to be back at 1. And then 360 for my max. So max is 3. Connect my points. there we have our graph. All right, so we have our graph. And all we really did was we used a pattern. We have max, mid, min, mid, max. All right? So for all these problems, all we really need to do is identify the numbers for A, B, C, D, identify the amplitude and period, always, and quarters as well, phase shift if there is a number for C, and all of the lines are essential as well. All right? If you guys still have any questions, feel free to email me. Hope you guys have a wonderful day.